Hi, welcome to Beyond Politics. I'm Catherine Clark. Supreme Court Justice Thomas Cromwell is an accomplished musician. In fact, his first degree is in music, and that was meant to be his career of choice, but he opted for the law instead. He practiced law, he taught at Dalhousie University for many years, and he was appointed to the Nova Scotia Court of Appeal before Prime Minister Stephen Harper appointed him to Canada's Supreme Court in 2008. Mr. Justice Thomas Cromwell joins me now to talk about the lay of the land from the Supreme Court of Canada. Mr. Justice Thomas Cromwell, thank you so much for being here today. It's a great pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you.
You are no stranger to the Supreme Court of Canada. You actually worked here as an executive legal officer for Chief Justice Antonio Lemaire. I don't want to say many years ago, but
thank you.
several
it was
years
a few,
ago.
Yes.
What was it like to come back as a justice?
Well, it was a huge surprise, as you can imagine. It was also very interesting to reconnect with Chief Justice McLaughlin. She was the only member of the court who was still here from my time. I was here from 1992 to 1995, and she was the only member of the court still here in 2008 when I joined the court. And it was interesting to see in some respects how little had changed in terms of the very demanding cases and challenging applications for leave to appeal and so on, but how much had changed in other respects. The technological change was, when you really compared it to the 90s, was huge. When I left in 1995, I'd only recently acquired a cell phone. I'd just started to use email and so on and so forth. And one of my main files when I was executive legal officer was actually working with CPAC to get the then pilot project for the televising of the court's hearings going. Yeah.
Wow.
And so I did a lot of work on that, and as you can imagine, some of the members of the court were not as enthusiastic as others. There have been many attempts over the years. I recently was reading Don Newman's book about a meeting that he had with Justice Wilson and McIntyre, which was very courteous until the end, when Justice Wilson told him that it would be over her dead body that there would be cameras in the Supreme Court. So we waited till Justice Wilson had retired.
Did you really?
No, she was gone when I got here. But Chief Justice Lemaire was quite interested, and obviously CPAC was quite interested. And the turning point, in fact, came when we installed a video conferencing system that used voice-activated cameras, a similar system to what we still have, where the cameras are fixed, but they are activated by voice. So if one of the judges is speaking, it picks up that member of the court and so on. This meant that there was no unusual lighting, no other people in the room, no one swinging around with the camera. So that really took the wind out of many of the objections to the process. The TV people weren't as keen on our voice-activated cameras as their own, but it was a start. And we agreed to a pilot project, which I think is still ongoing as far as I know.
You know, I can understand why there would be concern about having cameras in the court. But why did you feel that it was important that, in your capacity at that time, that people, regular Canadians, be able to see the court in action?
Well, I think that the then Chief Justice felt strongly that it's a public institution, that very few people have the opportunity to be in Ottawa or to watch a hearing of the court. This is a way of opening it up. I remember one particularly poignant example, which didn't have a happy ending but was still significant, was during my time here, the court heard the appeal in the Rodriguez case. And Ms. Rodriguez, by the time the hearing occurred, was not well enough to travel, but she was able to fully watch the entire hearing before the court from her home in Vancouver, I believe it was in British Columbia in any event, I think Vancouver. And that was, I think, a poignant example of how important it can be to have that kind of access to the court. We also hoped, and this has materialized, that some of this material would also be useful for teaching purposes. And I know that excerpts of our hearings are used for everything from language teaching to high school law courses to university law school advocacy seminars and so on, so that it's not only the availability to the general public, but also it's didactic purposes for many, many fields. Nowadays, of course, we're also mostly live on the web, so that we don't have to sit up at 1 o'clock in the morning to watch our hearings. They can be pretty much watched on demand unless there are complications with publication bans or something of that sort. But generally speaking, the hearings are available in real time on the web, and within a few days of the hearing they're archived and can be reviewed. So it's turned out to be a huge resource in many areas, and we got a lot of extremely positive press. I'll tell you one story. I was on a ferry in British Columbia going from Horseshoe Bay to Langdale, and I was getting my coffee and my corduroys, and a gentleman dressed like a truck driver or something came over to me and said, you guys do a good job up there. And I sort of looked at him a bit puzzled, and he said, "You're Judge Cromwell, aren't you?" And I didn't know whether to admit it or not, but I did. And he said, "You guys have got a tough job, and you do it good."
You know, those are the moments when you realize that it's important to always carry a comb to brush your hair.
I don't think he cared what my hair was like.
Yeah, you never know where you're going to be when somebody... But it's a good point. I mean...
And that was totally based on he watches the proceedings of the court on television.
You talked about the webcasts. Do you go back and look and see how things went during a hearing, you yourself?
No, my joke with my law clerks is, believe me, once is enough, but generally speaking, no, I don't. I take pretty good notes in court for my purposes. We also have access to a written transcript, so I've never found it necessary so far to go back and actually look at an exchange that occurred.
You have a very good institutional knowledge of the Supreme Court and how it functions. Did that help you when you first came back here as a justice? Did you feel a little more comfortable or a little less nervous because you understood how the court functioned, so it was going to be a little less of a learning curve?
I think it was of some help. I mean, obviously, it's very different being a judge than not being a judge. It brings with it a whole set of responsibilities.
Right.
But at least I had a pretty good understanding of the basic operations of the court, who was responsible for what, how the leave application process worked, how the judgment writing process worked. Obviously, there had been some changes, but most of the systems were pretty much the same. And so that did help a lot, I think, especially in the early few months. I know I had one colleague who had joined the court not that long before I did, who said, "You're so much better off knowing all this stuff. I had to sort of learn it the hard way, in a sense." And so I think it was of some help that way. But there's still a big adjustment when you're making the decisions.
At least you knew where all the washrooms were.
Mostly.
It's important to know.
Well, I'll tell you a funny story. The first morning on the job, I drove into what used to be the judge's garage, where, of course, I had never parked before, and I was rather looking forward to having the opportunity to park for the first time in the judge's garage. Little did I know that it had been converted into a gymnasium.
Oh,
so
did you drive into it?
No, I was prevented from that, but here I was, the new guy on the block, with my car parked, heading in, wondering why the door won't go up. And so I was the laughingstock of the building for about 2 weeks as a result of that escapade. So my previous knowledge wasn't always a help.
Yeah, okay. Point taken. Let's step back a little bit, because I wonder if the law was always a career the career choice for you, because you actually have a BA in music.
BMUS, in fact, yeah.
Yeah, well, so did you think you would work in music? Is this?
Yeah, my career ambition when I left high school was to become a professional musician. And my real love was pipe organ and choir directing. And so I did a Bachelor of Music degree and a diploma from the Royal Conservatory in organ in furtherance of that goal. But I began to realize the farther I went that I didn't think I had enough talent, frankly, to do the kinds of things I'd like to do in the music business. So I started to look around for something else. So I always say to people I'm the only guy on the Supreme Court because his music career didn't work out.
Was it a disappointing realization for you that you were not going to be able to follow that musical path, that dream that you had, or were you pragmatic about it and you just realized that?
I'm pretty pragmatic.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing is that there's nothing worse than being in a career where you feel you're not really up to it. And I was glad not to persist when I feared that I would just feel frustration in not really having the inner it's like basketball. You can't teach tall. And there are some things about music that you either have or you don't have, and I began to realize I didn't have some of them.
You seem like someone who's just very straightforward, very, this is the way it is, and okay, this isn't going to work, let's choose a different path. Are you that kind of a person? Are you an organized, disciplined person who? I
think so, yes. I mean, as somebody said, I'm the kind of person that would rather buy an umbrella than wish it weren't raining. And I think that in life generally, there are some things you can't change, and you have to deal with those.
Let's talk a little bit about going away to school. Am I right that you went to Oxford?
Yes, I did graduate work after law school.
Okay.
At Oxford, yes.
Okay. Did you ever consider staying?
At Oxford?
Yeah.
Oh, yes, I did. It probably was a mistake in some ways. I actually had funding that I could have stayed for 3 or 4 years, probably. But at that stage in your life, you've been in school a long time, and it seemed very important to article and get called to the bar and get at the professional law. So I did my 1 year and came back. But I think in retrospect, it might have been better to hang around and take advantage of all Oxford has to offer.
You came back and did what?
I came back and articled at a small law firm in Toronto, litigation firm, then called Weir and Folds, and then joined some friends from law school in my hometown of Kingston to practice.
Why did you go back to Kingston?
Well, this little group of people had become friends during law school, and we all had strong links to Kingston, and one day we were sitting around and somebody said, wouldn't it be fun to practice together? And we all said, yes, that would be good. So it wasn't perhaps a detailed plan. But,
it sounds like a break in tradition for you. Did you literally just say, okay, great, let's move?
Let's do it.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. Pretty
much. And but this was a plan actually before I went off to England that this would happen. A couple of us had been very active in the correctional law field in Kingston. As you probably know, Kingston's the penitentiary capital of the world, I imagine. And the law school in those days at Queen's had a clinical program where you did essentially legal aid work in the penitentiaries. And through that, we formed some pretty strong professional bonds and decided that we should carry on with that after we graduated. So I'm able to say that I am the member of the court who spent more time in jail than any other.
It doesn't seem to have done you much harm. How did you end up then in Nova Scotia?
Well, I went off to do graduate work after law school because I thought at some point I'd probably like to become a law teacher.
Right. Did you think you would enjoy that more than practicing?
Yes.
Even at that stage?
I did.
Okay.
And
sorry, when you went into law school, did you think you would practice?
Oh, yes.
So it was over the course of your time in law school when you decided that it was...
Yeah, I really liked the law school atmosphere. I loved the academic side of the law. Had some great profs, of course, who were quite inspiring. But I felt I also needed to have some practical experience. It's pretty hard to teach a subject like law if you don't know anything about it. But then a chance came to go to the Dalhousie Law School in Halifax in the early 80s.
As a prof.
As a prof.
Right.
And they were looking for someone with exactly my interests. And it was really almost par hasard that it happened, because one of the people who was on the hiring committee had been a colleague at Oxford, and I phoned him up and said, have you got any jobs? And he said, well, as a matter of fact, yes. What do you want to teach? And I said, well, procedure and evidence would be my two top subjects. And he said, that's exactly what we're recruiting for, so fax your CV. In those days you had to fax it, of course. And I did, and went down for an interview and was ultimately hired, and was very, very lucky to be hired at Dalhousie.
Was it nerve-wracking to make that change from a practice that you had started with friends to moving not just to a different profession, but in terms of teaching, but to a different province?
Well, there was that. I had started teaching a little at Queen's. The dean, when I was practicing, had asked me to teach part-time, which I'd done, and that was partly why I thought I'd really like to take this transition. In terms of our little firm, we had pretty much independent practices, so leaving wasn't going to create any problems for the other lawyers, so I didn't feel any problem that way. And I went and spent about a week and a half in Halifax in connection with the interview, and really became persuaded that I'd like living there. It was a little bit like Kingston on the ocean, because it had a strong military presence, a very strong university community, and long historical roots. And so I fell in love with Halifax and Nova Scotia almost instantly.
You taught for a very long time at Dal.
Oh, not that long.
Well, okay, you're right, because you're very... I apologize. No, it's okay. It wasn't that long. But in the middle of it, you left to come here to Ottawa.
Correct.
To be the executive legal officer. Why did you do that? Why was this such an opportunity that you couldn't turn it down? Well,
I had known two of the previous executive legal officers, and they had both told me what an incredible experience it was to work literally in the same office as the Chief Justice of Canada and in the Supreme Court. So it would be, I would have thought, almost any lawyer's dream to be at the center of things in that way. So I was very anxious to accept Chief Justice Lemaire's offer when it came. And my mother had grown up in Ottawa. I had spent a lot of time in Ottawa over the years, so moving here was no problem. In fact, it had some benefits in that we had, at that time, a young child who didn't have any immediate family in Nova Scotia, so it let him reconnect with my parents, spend time at the family cottage where I had grown up as a kid, and in fact even have his first communion in the church in the glebe where my parents had been married in 1942. So it really gave him more sense of his extended family than he'd had in Nova Scotia. So I think it was a very positive thing, both professionally and personally.
Was it a career advancing type of thing?
I didn't approach it that way. I mean, I just thought it was an incredible learning opportunity, and it certainly was that. It turned out to be a career-advancing thing in the sense that it was Chief Justice Lemaire who raised with me the possibility of whether I would consider becoming a judge. And I remember the day it happened. We were sitting in the bar in the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, and just out of the blue, over a glass of red wine, he said, "You know, Tom, have you ever thought about being a judge?" He said, "I think you have something to give in that area, having worked with you for a couple of years now." And I said, "Well, frankly, Chief, I hadn't thought about it, but I will." And I did.
You went back to Dal, though, first.
Correct.
And you went back and taught.
That's right.
So when the call came, had you kept thinking about it? Was this...
Not really.
Not really.
Not so much. I mean, I think it's one of those things that you express a willingness to do the job, and then it's out of your hands, and life goes on. So I was quite busy as both teaching. I was associated with a law firm in Toronto at the time as well on a part-time basis, and doing quite a bit of labor arbitrating. So I had a lot on the go, too much to think too much about what might happen.
It must have been pretty great, though, when the call came in asking you if you would consider being a judge.
Yes, well, I was...
The first time.
I was stunned, actually.
Were you?
Yeah. I was... we'd come back from a performance of The Important of Being Earnest in Wolfville, Nova Scotia.
Great cultural capital.
Got in, and the phone rang, and it was the appointments advisor to the then Minister of Justice, Anne McClellan, and advising me that I'd been appointed to the Court of Appeal for Nova Scotia.
That's pretty exciting.
I was actually stunned.
Were you speechless?
I'd have to be awfully stunned to be speechless. Any lawyer is rarely speechless. But I was very surprised, and it hit me in a funny way, too, because one of the things that hit me was I'm no longer a lawyer. I can't appear in court. I can't make legal representations on behalf of anyone. I can't give advice. And those are things that, when you've been a member of the bar for as long as I had at that point, you kind of took for granted. They were kind of part of your DNA. And I had great fun telling my colleagues in Toronto that I phoned one of the fellows I was working with and said, I've got some rather bad news. And of course I was in the middle of some cases at that point. And I said, I have some bad news. I said, I've been disbarred, which was literally true, because of course you can't be a member of the bar and a judge at the same time. And there was absolutely dead silence on the other end. And I said, yes, by order in council. And then they figured out what was going on. But it was a very strange feeling, and a mixed feeling, in the sense that you were closing the door on something for pretty much ever and starting something completely new.
How long did it take you to transition into the new role as a judge?
I'm probably not the one you should ask. It didn't feel as if it took long. I went directly to a court of appeal, and so that it was really reading files, hearing arguments, writing decisions. So there wasn't a huge difference in kind of day-to-day activity. There was obviously lots to learn, not suggesting otherwise. But I think I found the transition easy. Whether my colleagues would have agreed at the time, I won't venture an opinion, but I felt that I was ready and really loved the work.
Had you ever thought, once you became a judge, did it ever occur to you at any point, well, maybe one day, you never know, I could end up on the Supreme Court?
Not for a minute.
So what was it like when you got the call, when you knew you were being considered, and then when you were in the end appointed?
Well, the whole thing was kind of a surprise, because my predecessor, Justice Bachelor, was a relatively young man when he decided to leave the court. He'd served for more than 10 years, so I'm not in any way critical of that decision, but it was certainly unexpected that there would be a vacancy for the Atlantic region on the court. In fact, he and I are not that far apart in age. So even if I had aspired to it, it would never have occurred to me that there would be the possibility during my professional career. And then a lot of mixed feelings, because I was extremely happy on the Court of Appeal, loved Halifax. They used to make fun of me that I was more Nova Scotian than the people who'd been born there. And I think once you've lived near the ocean, it's hard to adjust to not living near the ocean. So there were many personal aspects about coming back to Ottawa.
You also had to move your family with you, did you?
Yes. Yeah, although our son was in school at Queen's at the time, so other than in the summers, had been away. And pretty much as soon as I moved to Ottawa, he decided to do graduate work in Newfoundland. So
we won't read anything into that.
No, I think it sort of speaks for itself, perhaps.
Am I right that you had appeared before the Supreme Court of Canada?
No,
but you'd had a ruling. Is that possible? You'd had a ruling overturned by the Supreme Court? Oh,
a couple.
A couple.
It's an occupational hazard on the Court of Appeal, I'm afraid.
Did it influence how you, I guess I'm wondering, did you have a bit more compassion for them because you'd been there?
Well, I think that always you treat a decision of another judge with respect, even if you believe it's wrong and has to be overturned. And I have tried to live by that, both as a justice of the Court of Appeal and here. But I never felt that anyone was unprofessional or inappropriately brusque with me when on those occasions when it was necessary to overturn my decisions in the public interest. And I didn't feel particularly vindicated when I was upheld. I just felt, everybody's doing their job, and that's the way the system works. And I hope judges feel that way, and certainly when I get the opportunity to speak to judges, I try to make sure they know that's the way I feel about it anyway.
You've talked about, and all of the justices have talked about, the all-consuming workload. What do you do to allow yourself to have some kind of outside life on those half a day a week when you are not working?
Well, I always try to take some time off in the evening, just to have dinner and so on, and just kind of unwind. I do quite a bit of traveling that is work-related, but is a complete change of pace, nonetheless, because we're all called upon often to do some speaking, and I've been very involved in an Access to Justice project that has led me to do a lot more traveling than would be normal over the last year or so. And that's a kind of relaxation, at least for me. I enjoy travel, and I enjoy meeting people, and so a change is good. And since I've come here, I've started to take longer summer holidays, just to get completely out of the milieu and to do something quite active. So the last couple of years I've gone on long hiking trips, just as a complete change of pace with no lawyers or judges around, and I find that's really very, very helpful.
Just briefly, in our final 30 seconds, I'm sure you don't often think this far ahead when at the next stage of your career, once you're no longer on the court. Would you go back to music?
It's one of the things I'd like to do. If so far, no arthritis, so it's at least theoretically possible. Whether I have the patience to do it, I don't know. I always joke with my music friends that sadly your judgment is the last thing to go. So
in your case, that's a good thing.
I suppose, but of your own musical performance, so
right.
that it's not satisfying anymore. So I'd have to do a lot of work to get it back to where I was getting any real enjoyment out of it. But it is kind of a secret, not secret anymore, I guess, retirement plan.
We'll watch for your second act. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great pleasure.
Thanks, Catherine.